All right, Jeff, I've got 5:30 if you want to take it away.
All right, I'll share my screen and get started then. Hello, can everybody see my screen and hear me okay? All right. I'd like to welcome you all to our third webinar in our series of dealing with impacts of growth. And this one is on housing. And I'd like to give a little bit of a background in terms of, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Beartooth Front Community Forum, we're a grassroots, nonpartisan organization. We focus on addressing regional and community issues, provide a venue for public education involvement, and promote thoughtful, constructive dialogue. In 2018, we developed a strategic plan we call Outlook 2030, when the idea behind that was to sort of take a bigger picture, broader look, and think about the future, and focus on changes that can affect community sustainability and resiliency on landscapes across the Beartooth Front, and define through community involvement a holistic vision for sustainable and resilient communities and landscapes. And these webinar series were our first effort at doing that. They were kind of a replacement to our normal approach, which is to actually have in-person community forums and dialogues. But with COVID, we adjusted and thought we would try out a series of webinars to at least focus on some of the education and issues that are facing the community, or could be facing the community in the future. I also kind of wanted to draw your attention to another series of webinars that are being promoted by or sponsored by Future West out of Bozeman. The last two webinars that they had was one on building strong towns. That was yesterday. And the one prior to that was how do patterns of growth affect our wallets? Both of those webinars were really enlightening in terms of what of really dealing with how communities are faced with dealing with the costs associated with expanding infrastructure, maintaining that infrastructure, and how it's paid for in the future. And both those webinars were recorded, and they're available to be that you can view them through the Future West website. And then kind of wanted to close out here in terms of, well, what's next? This housing webinar is the last in our spring series. And we've talked about having another webinar in the fall, maybe starting in September or early October, that might deal more with water supply, water allocation, how water rights are allocated, what happens in terms of when there's a water shortage, and who gets their water cut out, turned off, and who gets to retain their supply. And then we have also talked about what do we do after these webinars that we've provided a venue for information and discussions about some of the issues that we talked about. And depending on what our situation is, COVID is where our thought is to go back to a community-wide forum and discussion where we revisit these topics and focus on ideas, solutions, and community vision. So with that, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Amy or Robin, and I'll just close out with this slide that talks about how the webinar will be managed. And if you want to go ahead.
Robin, you can, so thanks, Jeff. So yeah, if you have any questions during this, if you'll just enter it into the chat, and we will try to address those questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards and on our webpage, which is beartoothfront.org. So Robin, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. If it, ooh, maybe I might not be able to share my screen actually. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Robin Adams. I'm the Workforce Housing Coordinator at the Red Lodge Area Community Foundation. And we've put together a expert panel of speakers that really have a lot of on-the-ground experience creating solutions to this affordable housing crisis across the state in communities similar to Red Lodge. So before we get into that, I just wanted to make sure that we all have that we're speaking the same language, just because when we talk about affordable housing, it can be really difficult to, have a discussion if everybody has a different definition. So HUD really just defines affordable as paying less than 30% of your income on housing. So it doesn't actually have anything to do with how much you're making. It just has to do with how much you're spending on your housing bill, whether it's rent or a mortgage. Workforce housing, usually that means housing that is affordable for people who work and live in a community. And so that brings in area median income, which will probably come up a couple of times. I'm sure many people are familiar with that term, or AMI. So 100% of the area median income in Carbon County is roughly $58,000. So anytime we're talking about 80% of the median income, we're talking about 80% of 58,000. So for the workforce, it's a household that's, somewhere within that range, usually 80% of the median income up to 120% of the area median income. And this conversation is important to have right now, just because basically in Carbon County, the median sales price of a single family home has been increasing by about 12.5% annually, which is much faster than other areas in Montana. It's a trend we're seeing in the whole housing market across the US, but especially as a resort community, we're getting hit pretty hard. And the area median income is not keeping up with that rate. So yeah, apologies. I did have some slides that I wasn't able to share, so sorry about that. But I'm going to go ahead and let the panel speakers introduce themselves, and then after they each get to speak for a little bit, we're going to move into Q&A at the end. So if you have questions as they go, feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll make sure that we address them when presentations are done. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start it off with Jacob Kuntz from Helena Area Habitat for Humanity.
Thank you, Robin. Yes, my name is Jacob Kuntz. I'm the Executive Director of Helena Area Habitat for Humanity. We are currently building homes in Red Lodge as part of the USDA's Mutual Self-Help Program. And I get questions all the time. What is Helena Habitat for Humanity doing in Red Lodge? And I'm glad you asked. It's a great question. Short history to this. Red Lodge used to have an affiliate, a Habitat affiliate. It was mostly volunteer folks. And over time, people passed away, moved on, and eventually they realized that there was need for the organization's assets to be absorbed by another organization, because it looked like building was not going to continue, the organization was not going to continue. And through that process, Red Lodge Area Community Foundation ended up absorbing the assets of the affiliate that used to be in Red Lodge. And they set about building a home there with Trust Montana, which was successful. They accomplished a few years ago, and is currently has a homeowner in the home. And we watched all this with awe. We were looking at this whole model because it involved land trusts, and that was something that we were very much interested in. Habitat has a history of working with families to afford home ownership. One of the problems that we've had, though, is especially in markets like in Montana, where, as Robin said, prices are increasing and homes are appreciated at a rate that it is, we end up losing these homes to the open market after only a few years. So in Helena specifically, and Robin can speak more to Red Lodge's specific numbers, but we were seeing year after year 10% increases in home prices. And in the last year alone during COVID, we saw increases in prices from 22 to 25%. And that is deeply concerning for the workforce that's here, because incomes are not rising at that rate, but housing is. So it's making harder and harder for workforce folks and people who are hardworking in the community to stay in the community. And and we didn't want to lose houses to the open market. And so we were very much interested in what Red Lodge was doing, quite innovative in the work with building. And we actually approached them and said, hey, what if we work together? And we were lucky that they were willing to do that. We just happened to have a grant through the USDA for mutual self-help. In that program, we gathered together a group of what we call owner builders. They build each other's homes over the course of what takes about a year. They start the build together and they don't move in until all the homes are completed. So right now we have 3 homes under construction, a fourth home is underway, and we have a build group that's going to be finalizing their home this summer, and another 3 homeowners that are going to be starting to build together for the future. So it was a way of putting together the foundation's interest in improving affordable housing conditions in Red Lodge with our interest in a couple different things. One was that land trust models. How do we keep homes permanently affordable so that we're not always just trying to fill the gap and put another house in the market and then losing it eventually? We are also interested in how do we as an organization work with communities that are remote from Helena. There are a lot of rural communities throughout Montana that are all desperately in need of housing. And not all of them can sustain an organization like Habitat for Humanity. in order to build housing. And so we were trying to find out, how do we as an organization work with communities to fulfill their housing needs without them having to set up the entire apparatus of a nonprofit organization. So our work in Red Lodge is very much I would call a pilot project of how do we work in land trusts, but also how do we work remotely. Our ultimate goal is to be serving more and more rural communities throughout Montana with affordable housing. And we're looking specifically at school districts that struggle to house teachers, rural hospitals and hospital association that struggles to find workers for rural clinics. But just in general, just workforce conditions and workforce housing for communities in general. It's been a very, it's been a fantastic experience over the last 2.5 years now. And we've just been so thankful to have partners like those at the foundation to work with, and with Trust Montana in their work with the land trust. I don't really know of another project of its kind, so it's a unique one that we have in Montana, and it's been successful, and I look forward to its continued success. That's a little bit shorter than I was given, but I might stop there, Robin, unless you want me to speak to something in particular.
No, I think that's great. I'm sure that some more will come up in the Q&A.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thanks, Jacob. Appreciate it. And now we can move on to some introductions from Austin Wallace and Hermina Harold with Trust Montana.
Right on. Thanks, Robin. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having us at this forum tonight. We're excited to be here. My name is Austin Wallace, and I'm the Outreach and Advocacy Coordinator for Trust Montana. And I'm here with Hermina Harold, my Executive Director for Trust Montana. Hi, Hermina.
Hi.
Hi. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Let's see if I can do this correctly. Okay, great. All right. So yeah, we'll talk about how community land trusts can create workforce housing. And we'll just jump right into it. So what is a community land trust? You heard Jacob mention that they're working with the community land trust model in Red Lodge. And so yeah, Trust Montana is a community land trust. And in general, they are nonprofit organizations that hold land in trust to keep homes and commercial buildings and potentially farmland available for the affordable for the long term. Trust Montana is Montana's statewide CLT, and there are 4 other community land trusts in the state. I always like to highlight that a community land trust is different from a conservation land trust. You might be familiar with a conservation land trust, but the 2 of us use very different legal mechanisms to accomplish our goals. The conservation land trust is going to conserve land to preserve its biodiversity and wildness using the conservation easement. And we preserve land to keep it affordable in the long term using the legal mechanism of a ground lease, which we could really get into the weeds with how the ground lease works. But that's basically the binding legal contract between the homeowner and the community land trust that maintains affordability in the long term. And Hermina will talk more about how that works in the next slide. We are not a builder. That's why we work with our great Habitat for Humanity affiliates across the state who are building pros, and we provide legal help and other assistance, to provide the legal framework for the community land trust to accomplish our goal to increase affordable housing in the state. And you'll see this picture here on this slide is of Trust Montana's first community land trust home in Red Lodge. And it's a 3-bedroom home that's permanently affordable to people earning less than 120% of the area median income in Carbon County.
Thanks, Austin. So how does a CLT work? In short, homeowners, businesses, or farmers can purchase the improvements. So that's like the structures and other things on the land, but the CLT owns the land forever. So that brings down the purchase price and the mortgage amount for the purchaser of the improvements and creates the situation where we can control the permanent affordability into the future. A ground lease is the legal contract that we enter into with the owner of those improvements, and that enforces the restrictions. It's like a 40-page legal document, and it really tries to look ahead into the future for every possible complication that could happen in the future, and in order to protect the public investment that goes into that project and make sure it serves more than just one family and serves one family to another into the future. One thing that tends to really help resort communities is that CLT homes cannot be turned into vacation rentals. They have to be owner occupied by their income qualified buyers. And that just ensures that people who live and work in the community can remain in the community for the long term, and they can build equity in their home, and it's not turned into a short-term rental. And those are they're taking over a lot of Montana in a lot of ways. And so it's just one important thing that we can do that is not a policy change or anything. It is only something that we do with community land trust properties. And policies around Airbnbs and other vacation rentals tend to be really hard to pass. So it is, in general, an excellent model for workforce housing. It has been working in Missoula and Bozeman and Kalispell for a long time. North Missoula CDC is probably the oldest CLT in the state, and it's been running for over 20 years. So go ahead. So as Jacob talked about, we do have a current project being developed in Red Lodge, really being built by Helena Area Habitat for Humanity. And where Trust Montana comes in is really at the time that the home buyers move into their homes. We then help support them in the long term and ensure that they maintain their home and that they sell it at an affordable price to the next income qualified buyer. So right now, Jacob's doing all the heavy lifting with Helena Area Habitat, and then we'll swoop in and help out a little more once they get sold. So another option that we are currently piloting in Missoula County and are kind of looking at trying to help create in Red Lodge is a buyer initiated CLT program. This is where grants, usually from HUD or other federal programs, are used to buy down the purchase price of an existing home for an income qualified buyer. And then we transition the market rate homes into permanently affordable homes using the CLT model. So we essentially buy down the purchase price and take the land out of the equation in perpetuity. So we subsidize it once, and then the next family and the family after that all have the benefit of that subsidy. So we're looking at doing that in Missoula County starting next month, and we're really excited to see how it works out. We're also looking at rentals. Community land trusts can have rental properties. In Montana, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any rentals on CLT property, but HRDC might have some, and Brian Geyer can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But we are really interested in trying to work on creating more permanently affordable rentals in the state. So we're always looking for partners to help develop rental projects. So just to clarify, because we're not builders and because we are statewide, we try to provide very specific services to communities. So it's stewardship of the permanent affordability is what we step in and take care of. So every CLT project needs a few components in order to come into existence. We always need a builder, obviously, unless we're doing a buyer initiated program where we're purchasing up existing homes. We need land available for development. We need subsidy to buy down the home prices for the initial investment that we will then preserve. And some of those funds can come from HOME, which is a HUD program. Sweat equity is included in the subsidy list because all that work that the home buyers put into building the home really turns into equity for them and helps bring down the cost of the purchase price of the home. CDBG is another federal program that you can get grant funding from to help subsidize a project. And then local employer investments and other private grants can always come into play to help make something affordable to begin with so that we can then protect the affordability. So I'll give it back to Austin.
So there's a lot of other creative funding sources for workforce housing. I've just highlighted 2 of them here on this slide. The first one is the Housing Trust Fund, or a Housing Trust Fund in Missoula. They, in July of 2020, the Missoula City Council voted to create and contribute to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which officially created a mechanism for the city to finance affordable housing. The trust fund requires that the city contributes $100,000 per year from the city's general fund toward the fund, in addition to $1 million per year from the Missoula Redevelopment Agency, with the goal of funding it at a level of $10 million in the next 5 years. So it's really exciting to see what will happen with the Housing Trust Fund. And it's exciting to see a city focus in on affordable housing and then create a funding mechanism to make it happen. And another great example is the resort tax, which I'm sure, as being a resort town in Red Lodge, you're very familiar with this idea, but in Big Sky, they have used the resort tax to fund the state's newest community land trust, the Big Sky Community Housing Trust. And just a little background on the resort tax, in the 80s, the community really started to feel the pressures of the influx of tourists in the area. And after many discussions and negotiations in 1992, the general electorate of Big Sky voted in favor of imposing a 3% resort tax on the retail value of all luxury goods and services sold within the boundaries of the Big Sky Resort area. And now that resort tax is being used in part to fund the community, or the Big Sky Community Housing Trust, who has the goal of trying to solve the community's housing crisis. And they are currently working on a 52-unit development that will ensure home ownership for people who are living and working full-time in Big Sky. And they use the community land trust model to ensure permanent affordability for those units. And then more ideas that, as a community land trust and people really focused in on housing, we're always looking to partner and seek out developers who are interested in developing affordable housing projects. So we are building a developer toolkit to engage developers who are interested in working with community land trusts. And the toolkit will feature information about funding mechanisms and how to partner with CLTs to build more workforce housing across the state. So that is it for us. Thank you. I'll pass it to you, Robin. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, both of you. That was fantastic. And now moving on to Brian Geyer from HRDC.
Hi, everybody. I just want to extend a hello from your neighbors over in Livingston. We are just in the process of wrapping up the Park County Housing Coalition working group, where they are devising strategies and an action plan to address their, I don't really like to use the term affordable housing. We stole this from Homeward. We just use the term homes that people can afford. I see the thumbs up from Andrea there. Yeah, so, you guys aren't alone. And I applaud you for recognizing that there's an issue and that, the community really does need to coalesce around some strategies to, kind of figure out what you want your community to look like as you move forward with these new kind of realities. I'll share my screen real quick. Let's see. All right. Let's do this actually. All right, can you see that, Austin? Or can you see that, Robin? All right, great. So HRDC, we are an organization based in Bozeman, Montana. Our service area is Gallatin Park and Marr counties. So we have projects down in West Yellowstone, over in Gardner, up in Big Sky, and most recently we finished a 24-unit land trust project here in Bozeman in the Oak Davis area, where we offered 24 townhomes to our workforce. But in honesty, CLT is really just one tool that HRDC uses to kind of help address the affordable housing issue in our community. When I first arrived, I worked in Park City, Utah, developing land trust properties for 10 years. And when I got to Bozeman, I would always point to, Park City or Jackson Hole as the cautionary tale of what a community can look like without some thoughtful approaches to their workforce and how you're going to house those folks. But the reality is the cautionary tale is Bozeman. Our single family home price just eclipsed $700,000. I think we're at $704,000 now. Single room rents are right around $1,000, and that's not for a one bedroom. That's for a single room in a unit. So we are the cautionary tale. Our Big O tire shop is advertising jobs for $20 an hour, and they can't fill those jobs. And it's a basic kind of cause and effect of they can't pay enough for our workforce to be able to live in our community. So our workforce has really been hollowed out here in Bozeman, and so we are now the cautionary tale. So what has HRDC done across our service area to kind of try to address these issues? And so the first thing that we have is just a set of guiding principles, because you got to have some guardrails before you kind of embark on this. So, some mutual understanding about what it is what you believe in terms of housing for your community. And here are some examples of what we decided on. Residents deserve safe, stable, and accessible homes within a reasonable proximity to school, work, and essential services, affordable to households earning local wages. We also have a recognition that there we go. I'm not very good at this. Recognition that the entire community benefits from affordable housing, and your community health really depends on having an adequate supply of homes, but not just the McMansions that Bozeman is becoming known for. You need to have an adequate supply of homes available to residents that have a various income levels and various household sizes. The solutions to providing affordable housing should involve diverse approaches. I say this pretty frequently. There is a silver bullet. There isn't a silver bullet that a community can decide upon that's going to single-handedly address the issues. It has to be a bundle of approaches. I'm sure that Andrea will talk about LIHTC, so I won't dwell on that, but LIHTC is one of those. Low-income housing tax credit is one of those tools. The community land trust is certainly one of those tools, but also policy work and zoning work. So, there is no one silver bullet. It's a multifaceted approach that you have to kind of embrace. Some of the other guiding principles kind of talk more about community vibrancy and kind of like a feel of a community. And it should feel lived in. It should have vibrant neighborhoods. It should have multi-generational families. It should have all of these things. But also, here in Bozeman, our natural landscape is one of the major appeals of this community. So, we want to preserve those natural landscapes, and Red Lodge is certainly no exception in terms of natural landscapes. A group that we really rely pretty heavily upon in terms of how we frame our work is a group called Local Housing Solutions. And so I always suggest them as a resource to communities who are kind of embarking on this homes that people can afford work. And so some of their guiding policy frameworks are, one, create and preserve dedicated affordable housing units. Align your housing supply with market and neighborhood housing conditions. Help households access and afford private market homes. So doing things like proof of concept projects or pilot projects, very similar to what you guys did with Habitat there in Red Lodge. And then protect against displacement and poor housing conditions. So, protect the affordable housing that you have in place. One of the huge issues that we've encountered here in Gallatin County is the displacement of our mobile homes. Those were naturally occurring affordable housing units, and they're being displaced. And when you lose those mobile housing units, you don't get them back. And the housing that replaces them is very frequently not at the same income level that the mobile homes were the mobile homes were providing. So those are kind of some of our framework. So I'm going to quickly go through some of these housing tools that HRDC utilizes, and I'll talk about what income areas are they impacted by, who else is using the tool, what does it kind of look like, and kind of what would need to be in place to help, what would need to happen to use the tool in your community. Let's see. All right. Like I said earlier, I'm not going to dwell on this because Andrea knows more than I will ever know about the low-income housing tax credits. But if you look at, it is by far the most elegant tool to create low-income multifamily units in the state of Montana. You're looking at low and moderate income renters at that kind of 40 to 70% AMI income tranche. Who else uses this tool? It's used broadly across the state of Montana and really all across the country. What would have to happen in Red Lodge to use this tool? Really, you'd have to come up with a cohort of people who were interested and capable of bringing together partners to drive a project like this. Rehab loans and grants. These are projects. So these are efforts to kind of maintain the housing that we have. Those that like I mentioned earlier, the naturally occurring affordable housing. If you can provide people who live in a mobile home with a grant to rehab their home, it allows them to stay in those units longer. So those impact our low and moderate income families, and this is being implemented throughout Montana. Austin referred to this earlier, and this is something that we've utilized up in Big Sky pretty heavily. The Big Sky Resort Tax Board funds affordable housing to the tune of several $1 million. The project, the Meadowview project that Austin referred to, was kicked off with a $1.5 million award from the Big Sky Resort Tax community. So it's being utilized not only in Big Sky, but West Yellowstone has gone down the road of using resort tax dollars to fund affordable housing, as well as Gardner. So, you'd be in good company if that was something you were to look at. A big policy discussion that's happening, particularly over in Park County, is this kind of increasing the creation of accessory dwelling units. So, this goes to the concept of infill and kind of utilizing the housing that you have already to increase your supply, because ultimately what we're talking about is a supply issue. And so I would encourage you to look at what Livingston and Bozeman and other communities are doing to kind of facilitate the creation of those accessory dwelling units, because it does increase your supply of affordable rentals. The resident-owned community program. This is one of my favorite. Programs in the state of Montana, and our partners at NeighborWorks Montana drive this project. And what they do is they identify mobile home parks that are at risk of being purchased by real estate investors, and they bring together the residents of those communities and enable them to purchase the mobile home park for their own kind of management. And so we've seen this most recently over in Livingston with a project they call Vista View. And they brought together the entirety of the mobile home park and were able to purchase that and protect that mobile home park. And all of the people who were in that in the Vista View mobile home park now have an ownership stake. And so, you're seeing an increase in pride of ownership, in responsibility and accountability towards one another. And they've also protected themselves from being displaced. So it's a fantastic tool. Down payment assistance is something that's offered broadly across the state of Montana. When you really think about, and obviously current housing conditions may not be very conducive to down payment assistance, but when you think about home ownership traditionally pre-COVID, the biggest hurdle, if you ask somebody if they can afford $1,500 a month or $2,000 a month on a mortgage, they're like, yeah, that's not really that much different from what I'm paying in rent. The real kind of barrier for a lot of folks is coming up with that lump sum of money for that down payment. And that's been the difficult barrier for people to overcome. So there are programs, Home being one of them, that offers down payment assistance to low and moderate income families to help them get their foot in the door of home ownership. You're usually targeting that 70% AMI income tranche. And it really is being used widely across the state of Montana. I think Ermina and Austin really covered community land trusts, but they, in terms of creating those deep levels of affordability that people need to get into home ownership, there is no better way than taking the cost of land out of the equation. And that's beneficial to the community because those homes are affordable in perpetuity. You can put restrictions on them, as Ermina mentioned, to prevent things like house flipping, second home ownership. You can prevent them from being put on Airbnb because with the ownership of the land comes the capacity to add restrictions that will protect the affordability of that home in the long run. So we really, at HRDC, this is the main tool that we use when we're actually building our homes. So, I encourage you to reach out to Ermina and her colleagues at Trust Montana. They are, they're really terrific, and the Community Land Trust, I think, has a lot of potential to really kind of reshape what home ownership looks like in our communities. Inclusionary zoning, this is obviously an outdated slide that is no longer an option for us here in Bozeman, but perhaps in the future we can revisit that. Some other kind of strategies that communities have employed that we've helped them embark upon: land banking, which is where a municipality just purchases land and sits on that land, whether to in the hopes to either develop affordable housing actually on the property in the future, or by liquidating that property in the future and using those funds for the creation of affordable housing. We've been pretty strategic in our zoning reforms and loosening some of our land use restrictions here in Bozeman. Short-term rental regulation. I think that a lot of people have an issue with Airbnbs and short-term rentals, and I think that it's easy to place the displacement of a lot of families and the loss of a lot of long-term rentals on the prevalence of Airbnb. But the reality is, there's a fine line to be walked, because, if you have people who are seeing their property taxes increase and are being burdened by their mortgage, having an ADU in the back that they use as a short-term rental can really be beneficial in terms of keeping people in place and increasing the affordability of their housing situation. So I think in certain circumstances, short-term rentals, Airbnb, VRBO, there are some benefits. But the flip side of that is, for example, up in Big Sky, we saw in one single year 500 families and individuals who were displaced by landlords who were converting their long-term rentals into short-term rentals and VRBOs. So there can definitely be a kind of a negative side to that. And I think it's up to communities to decide, what line are we going to walk and how are we going to both allow people to use their property in a way that keeps their mortgage and their property taxes affordable, while also, maintaining that stock of long-term rentals that you absolutely need to house your workforce. Some of the tools, go ahead.
This is good stuff, but just because we only have 15 minutes left, I want to make sure we still have time for questions.
All right, I will wrap it up. And, if anybody has any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me. And I apologize for being so long-winded about this.
Okay, it's easy to talk about all day, I know. So really quick, just before we move on into questions, if we could hear from Andrea from Homeward in Missoula.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel and part of this conversation. Robin, can you see my slides?
I can't. I don't know if anyone else can.
No, you know why? Because I didn't share my screen.
That'll do it.
Basic thing. Sorry. Zoom, after a year and a half of Zoom, you think I would get it, but 6:15, I haven't had dinner. So bear with me. Can you see it now?
We can, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Appreciate that. Appreciate the opportunity. Congratulations to you as a community for having this conversation. It's critically important. I think we all know that, and I just commend you for having it. Homeward, our mission, we use sustainable methods to strengthen Montana communities by teaching homebuyer education and financial skill building and creating safe, healthy homes that people can afford. Just a quick note about us. We're a Montana Community Housing Development Organization. That is a HUD designation, even though we're a nonprofit organization, and it allows us to access some funding. We were established in 1994. So we've been around for about 26, 27 years. We both build and rehabilitate homes that Montanans can afford. And we also are an education center. We're a HUD housing counseling agency, part of the NeighborWorks Montana network. Human Resource Council in Bozeman is also part of that statewide partnership. And we provide financial education and counseling, renter education, and homebuyer education. These are the communities where Homeward does have properties that we have developed around the state of Montana. I'm going to be kind of going through this pretty quickly. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So we've done quite a bit of work in varying scales and sizes, and I want to quickly just look at a couple of examples here. Blue Bunch Flats is a project in Livingston. We partnered with the Human Resource Council there. The community of Livingston, there were some folks that had reached out and were seeking some more options. The rental market there is impacted, has been for a long time, and even more so now by investment property buyers, seasonal workers, tourist-based economy, and just lack of new home construction in general. The Blue Bunch Flats project is the reuse of the former Livingston Memorial Hospital. It's really unique. It's built in the middle of an existing neighborhood. So it's got public infrastructure, it's close to services and amenities and jobs. There's some real benefits to that: efficient land use and historic preservation. Many people have contacted me and said, I was born in that hospital, or my father passed away there, and lots of good and maybe painful memories, but memories just the same. In this property, we repurposed the former hospital into 37 apartments. There are 7 studios, 16 one-bedrooms, and 14 two-bedroom apartments. This gives an example of what they look like on the interior. The rents at this building range from about $450 up to $888, and it's permanently affordable. It's affordable to folks, you can see, for people earning 40 to 60% of the area median income in Livingston. And so this gives a range down here. You can see 40% for one person is about $10 an hour, and 60% for a 3-person household, and this is assuming that they are a single earner, they would be about $19 an hour. So you see the range of incomes that are able to be served in a property like this. It really takes a village. We had a number of different partners and ways in which folks contributed to the development of this site. We called out the environmental work here because there was quite a large asbestos cleanup that we had to work through, and there are resources out there in order to accomplish that. So, you know, that can be a challenge. It can be expensive, but it's doable. This is a housing tax credit project. That's what Brian just spoke to. So we use the federal housing credits, which basically means we competitively apply for credits, and then we sell those to private investors. And we use the money that we sell to the investors from, we use their cash to help buy down the cost of construction. We also got this building on the Federal Historic Register, and that enabled us to use both state and federal housing tax credits. So we're layering all these sources. In addition, we have mortgage financing on this building, different kinds of grants, both private and federal, and we deferred some of the developer fee that we earn, we put right back into the building in order to provide another source. Lots of collaborative work here. These are all different funders and state entities that we've worked with. Real quickly, I'll just keep running through my slideshow because I want to be cognizant of time here. Another project I wanted to highlight is in Whitefish. We have built the Alpenglow apartments in Whitefish. This is a new construction example. Up there, very similar to the communities we just talked about, real estate market has just been so incredibly challenging for local workers. And this was, of course, before COVID. I have this quote here saying, employers sought out solutions because jobs were left unfilled. So just like Brian talked about with the Big O tires, happening in Whitefish significantly. These are photos we took up there when we went up for one of our partner meetings, and there was just all of these hiring signs in these downtown businesses. The city of Whitefish and local businesses, mostly through the Chamber of Commerce, led a very significant community-wide effort to develop a workforce housing strategy. And their number one strategy was they needed to build apartments for the service industry. That is really one of their main economic engines. Now, they have a whole range of different priorities, but that was their number one priority. So the Whitefish Housing Authority was tasked with finding a viable partner, and that was Homeward. So we partnered with the Whitefish Housing Authority to build Alpenglow apartments. The project is just completing lease up. The rents there range from $433 to $939. The building type is different. There are 12 one-bedrooms, 22 bedrooms, and 6 3-bedroom apartments. And again, it ranges from 40 to 60% of the area median income. So in that area, you can see it's about the same. People earning about $950 to about $1,850 an hour. It also takes a village. The city contributed dollars for this. I saw there was a question in the chat. I'm eager to answer that. The Whitefish Housing Authority loaned $50,000 to the land acquisition, and we were able to then do some land preservation for a second phase later on for the Whitefish Housing Authority. And the city was of great support when we went in for funding applications. Real quickly, this is the homeownership example where we partnered with Trust Montana, and they went through some great details. So I'll stop there. These small homes were actually something we bought from the HRDC in Bozeman. So I guess what I would like to illustrate is that there is a lot of partnership opportunities and things happening in the state. And I'm happy to answer questions, Robin. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll go ahead and be available for questions.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, thank you everybody for taking that time. And I mean, I think it's obvious that this is a complicated subject and it's easy to, you know, talk about a lot of details. So Amy put into the chat, we're going to stick around until 7. Some of the panelists may have to take off, but if you would like to stay so that we can, you know, go through some of these questions, you're very welcome to. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with the first one that came in. A reminder, if you have a question, then you can go ahead and put it into the chat and I will read it out to the panel. So the first one that we have here is from Pete. So with the exception of possible tax relief, does this evening's panel believe that county or city governments should, by consensus of those local governments, directly fund or contribute to the costs associated with affordable housing for those whose income makes it difficult to live within a reasonable distance to their job or jobs? And for the panel, I'll let you decide who makes the most sense to take a stab at that one.
Well, this is Andrea with Homeward. I'll go ahead and jump in and say that I do believe that local governments should participate either through directly funding or contributing to cost reduction associated with home development that is affordable. I think that when local government contributes tax dollars, we need to make sure that those homes stay permanently affordable. And many of the panelists talked about different mechanisms to do that. You know, years ago, we saw the playing around with incentives, and I think that this is still a goal for many of our local jurisdictions, is to see, is there a way to incentivize the market so we could produce enough homes just through supply that we would not have to necessarily regulate those homes. And that is proving more difficult than it is possible to obtain with all of the circumstances that we talked about. So I think that our communities are stronger when everyone can afford a home. And you know, you heard the example earlier in Bozeman, we're working at Big O Tire at $20 an hour. They're not able to fill their open jobs because people can't afford to live in that community. And ultimately, those are the kind of services that we all rely upon in order to get to work and to get our kids to school. And if folks that are providing our services can't live in the community, then it's just not really a holistic community, in my opinion. So yeah, local government needs to participate, in my opinion.
I'll tag on to that. Yeah, I agree with everything there. And you asked that question to a bunch of people work in housing, so you can expect the answer. But it's definitely, you know, it's getting harder and harder, especially with prices, cost of materials. Just building a house in Red Lodge over last year is over $25,000 more just because of material costs. And automatically when that happens, it prices people out of the market. So Habitat used to be able to really easily access people who are more on the 30% of the local incomes. And that's increasingly more difficult. And we're not able to serve those folks. That puts a strain on the entire economic base of a community, because those are your workers. You know, those are people who are living in that community, who are working at different businesses and making these communities run. So, you know, it's my personal view and my professional view is that when we're working with local municipalities who are making the best decisions for the tax dollars in their communities, that they should consider a housing as part of the investment in a community's infrastructure, but also the economic infrastructure and the vitality of the community. So.
Yeah, thanks both of you. Did any other members of the panel want to speak to that one? I can move on to the next questions too. Okay.
I would say amen to that, but they both said how they feel about it, and I think it's just important to remember that someone has to pay for affordable housing, homes people can afford, and it's expensive, but it's really, really necessary for a healthy community. So, yeah.
I have
Thank
another.
you.
Thanks, Pete. I have another question that's sort of along the same vein. Just she feels that it is not the government's responsibility to interfere with the free market. While the rhetoric is strong and has been for decades, there should be a more comprehensive solution than an occasional multiplex or a group of cabins. And so the question is, you know, how to create a more comprehensive solution than a couple of units here and there.
I'd be happy to take the first stab at that. There are several communities in the state of Montana that have taken on housing strategy. During my presentation, I talked about the community of Whitefish. That was largely spurred from local businesses and employers because of the sheer lack of workers that were there to keep their businesses open. We have here, I'm based out of Missoula, and the city of Missoula has undertaken an extensive process to put a city housing policy and strategy in place. And it really does address a full continuum of different home prices. But like it was talked about earlier in some of the panel presentations, it concentrates on 120% and below of the area median income, which generally is the workforce of our communities. And I completely agree that it has to be a comprehensive strategy. So some examples in that strategy in the City of Missoula's housing policy is the accessory dwelling unit and loosening regulations around the accessory dwelling unit in order to incentivize them to be built. There are some that they anticipate being built with no regulatory framework. And then there is some greater incentive through the city identifying ways to help pay for building permit fees or some other ways. If the homeowner that owns that accessory dwelling unit chooses to lease that home to people that are have obtained a rental assistance voucher, a housing assistance voucher. A lot of, for example, a lot of elderly folks or folks living with disabilities have a housing assistance voucher. Then there's some financial incentives for those folks, but they have to agree for how long they're going to hold those homes available for people that are using a housing assistance voucher. Some of the other things they've identified have been, and we identified, my organization took an active role in this, was collaborating on the expenditure of infrastructure dollars. Communities spend money on infrastructure anyway. Depending on the size of your community, you'll get more in terms of some of the federal dollars that flow through to the state. But either way, Department of Transportation dollars are flowing through to your community, as are local dollars to fund infrastructure. So pair that with affordable housing development and incentivize the public infrastructure that is a cost to developers. So that cost, putting in a water line, putting in a sewer main, that cost is borne to developers whether the home is affordable or not, and that cost is passed along. So if the city is already, the community is already going to put in sewer, water, maybe planning some of those infrastructure needs, then coordinate and collaborate with homes that the workforce can afford, and that helps alleviate some of the cost of the developers. And then those homes can be made more affordable, whether they'll be rental or home ownership. So those are some of the examples that I would like to share from just Missoula's housing policy. Bozeman has one, as does Helen. Has been doing a lot of things. So a lot of our communities have been doing some good work.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? Okay. Thanks, Andrea. I appreciate that a lot. It's really good to hear about what other communities are doing, because really what's happening over there is not very different from what's happening here. So having a blueprint is pretty essential. And this is a question that came in before the webinar from someone who wasn't able to make it today. What would be the possibility or ramifications of putting a cap or restrictions on vacation and Airbnbs and out-of-state property grabs? Anyone brave enough to answer that one?
I don't. So the question is, what are the ramifications of putting a cap on that?
The ramifications and the possibility to do it. Like, is it possible?
I think, you here in Bozeman, they've done overlays of various neighborhoods and zoning districts that they will allow people to create short-term rentals in, and other zones where they are prohibited. I think that that's one approach. You certainly have to register with the government or with the city to have an Airbnb here in Bozeman. But I think we've had more luck, I guess, with the incentives that we've implemented up in Big Sky. So what we did was, to kind of start to get some of those long-term rentals back into the housing stock and get them shifted from being a Airbnb or short-term rental. The community up there offers some incentives, things like property management, tenant vetting. They even have a partnership with the Big Sky Resort to offer season passes in exchange for homeowners who take their homes out of the short-term rental pool and return them back to the long-term rental pool. So to my point earlier, I think that there's a line to be walked there for providing incentives, providing guidelines, but also, I don't think anybody is advocating for an outright prohibition of Airbnbs. I think that, in certain circumstances, they can be a really effective tool in keeping housing affordable for people and, helping them counteract some of the increasing property taxes and things like that we're seeing in these communities. So I think there's an appropriate place for them. The conversation that has to occur in the communities, and this is the conversation that we had in Big Sky, was, where is that line? Where do we want to draw our line in the sand? Because the reality is you need long-term rentals to house your workforce. And if you don't have them, again, back to my Big O example, if you don't have if you don't have long-term rentals, you don't have employees for places like Big O, and it doesn't matter how much they offer per hour.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I think that touches on both. It just needs to be a balance, allowing them while also making sure that the long-term rentals are available for the workforce. I have a question from Hope Smith about ADUs. So does the accessory dwelling infill include things such as tiny houses? Many Red Lodge lots are double lots, which would have room for a second smaller unit. And how does our current zoning address this sort of development? And I know we have a couple members of the planning board on tonight with the city of Red Lodge. And so if either of you want to speak to the current zoning regs on ADUs, feel free to unmute too.
This is Jeff, and I'm on the planning board. And as far as I know, there are no current restrictions on having accessory dwellings on a lot. I think as long as they meet the minimum setbacks that are imposed, that the city currently has in its zoning, I don't believe there's anything restricting that right now.
Yeah, and Jeff, I think that's right. The setbacks and also parking requirements need to be met. And there are no impact fees for ADUs in the city of Red Lodge.
Oh, Robin, I have a tale to add to this. It's a bit of a cautionary tale. In 2006, during the last housing boom that we experienced here, the city of Missoula, the city council, eliminated a number of tools that we had in place. And to the question earlier about doing something without an orchestrated plan, I think this was probably the result of that. There were density bonuses allowed in certain parts of town, and it didn't end up in affordability. It ended up in investment homes. And I think you had neighborhoods that were concerned about change, and they saw the accessory dwelling unit as one of those things, but really, quite frankly, those two things were not the same. Either way, the city council eliminated them. And ultimately, those two things, without really addressing zoning and other ways to increase the ability for affordable homes to be built, ended up really creating a stagnation in the number of just homes on the market. And we're living that today, right? Builders get out of the business. There's a lot of different issues for that. So a few years ago, the city of Missoula put an ordinance forward allowing accessory dwelling units, but they were so restrictive. They were so difficult. It was their way of meeting the neighborhood's concerns about change, but it didn't really incentivize accessory dwelling units. And some of those things that we reevaluated and changed as part of the affordable housing policy were, we eliminated the need for a separate off-street parking space for an accessory dwelling unit. That was clearly a hindrance to anybody being able to afford building an accessory dwelling unit on the back of their lot. The other thing that was changed was the ownership requirement. And this is something that we've seen all around the country, where the the person that is going to develop the accessory dwelling unit has to own the main house. And the issue with that is it's a financing issue, because the city had to put a restriction, a lien on the property, and the banks don't like that. The banks don't like any other lien in front of their mortgage. So it ended up being a challenge for the homeowner to finance the cost of developing that accessory dwelling unit. So that has been changed. Also, height requirements. They had put a height, and I know some other communities have a size requirements where they almost want the unit to be, the home to be a certain size. And the answer is one of the other questions earlier, which is, can we use tiny homes for these? Well, the short answer is yes, as long as you don't have some of these other restrictive elements that require the accessory dwelling unit to almost mimic a second home on the back of the lot. So there are definitely ways in which, and there's been a lot of research out there to show that relaxing regulations around accessory dwelling units does not upend your community into the super dense. It's like it's a quiet, easy way almost to densify your existing urban build out of your community. There's already alleys, there's already streets, there's sidewalks, hopefully, in some parts of town. You know, my neighborhood doesn't. For example, I live right here in the middle of Missoula. You know, we all experience places where infrastructure didn't get built out. But it's really, I think there's really some great ways that Red Lodge could learn from other communities in Montana and how they've gotten some really usable policies in place.
I'll jump in there. You know, in Helena, we've, you know, I saw the question here about zoning, which is fantastic. And to tag on to what Andrea said here, just, it's true that there's all these different elements that get in place, and sometimes they fight against one another with zoning policy. Used to live in the Middle East, and there was a old saying, they'll shine your shoes, but then they'll knock your hat off. It's kind of a similar concept. One of them in Helena that was there for quite some time was that you could only build on 30% of any lot, so lot coverages, which is something that we've been working on for quite some time. It meant there was quite a bit of land within the city limit, and it was all undevelopable just because of zoning requirements. Again, you know, height restrictions, parking requirements, size of units, all that goes into whether or not it's feasible or not to add accessory dwelling units to that. And, you know, in Helena, we've had some great progress in being able to kind of unlock some of those restrictions that made it basically impossible to develop anything, even though the zoning policy said, oh yeah, you can do that. You can build you can have 2 dwelling units per lot. Just the other elements of the zoning made it impossible to actually do so.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob and Andrea. That touches on a couple of questions too that have been in the chat box. But in addition to ADUs, Jeff asked what other adjustments in zoning have communities made to facilitate affordable housing or participate in various programs such as community land trusts.
Well, some of the things could be as easy as parking requirements, and depending on the zoning, assuming that there is other infrastructure that allows mobility. So an example here in Missoula is both, you know, for affordable rentals at a certain income or senior, for example, knowing that a lot of times those households really only do have 1 car or less. We actually did a parking count, and I know this is Montana, and I know that we all have a car or more, but there are a lot of households that don't. And there are a lot of households that depend on either public infrastructure or public transportation if you have it. And so reducing the parking requirements can actually be a very significant move, and that's something to consider. We, in the development world, we call it carkitecture, not architecture, because when you see a lot, you figure out how many cars can I park first? Now, how many people can I build a home for?
What is it, like two parking spots per unit, and they have to be 15 by 22. That's a lot of square footage, so it's big numbers.
here in Bozeman, we have an affordable housing ordinance that we passed, and part of that affordable housing ordinance allowed, if you were committed to pricing your home below a certain level, you were allowed to reduce your lot sizes, and it also allowed for reduced setbacks. And so we did a project called the Humble Homes Project, which is a 400 square foot home for home ownership and a 300 square foot home for home ownership. And we were able to put that on a reduced lot. And it really kind of allowed us to demonstrate to market rate developers, which, you know, a lot of the projects that we do are really proof of concept, because if we can only, you know, to somebody's point earlier, we can only build so many homes. It really we have to demonstrate to market rate developers that there's a market for these things. And so using this affordable housing ordinance to create 2 small homes on two smaller individual lots, we were able to demonstrate to the market rate developers that people are interested in a smaller home and that there's a market for them, and B, it can be done reasonably well within the guidelines of the affordable housing ordinance. So that was just one way the city of Bozeman really kind of put their skin in the game by changing their city code to allow for the creation of affordable units.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I appreciate your experience with that. And I'll skip through Walter's question because that really touched on it too. Amy had a question about short-term rentals. So is there accountability for Red Lodge in collecting taxes from short-term vacation rentals? And I know that James isn't on tonight, and he's the city's community development director. So, I mean, from my conversations with him, there is more accountability, or at least there is more, what's the word that I'm looking for, compliance than in other communities. So we're at about 60% without having software to track all of the various short-term rental websites, and, you know, tracking, like, sometimes there's a listing posted and it gets taken off and put on one of 60 different websites. So it's somewhat of, yeah, I think it could be better, but the fees collected don't necessarily, the city wouldn't be able to have enough income to warrant buying software to do the tracking. But without James being on here, I don't know if I can speak to that much more. Would the panel be able to speak to other communities tracking compliance with short-term rental fees and things like that?
We have an ordinance in place here in Missoula, but I'm not really certain of the efficacy one way or the other of compliance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. And we will wrap it up pretty soon here because we're over time. But yeah, I think I don't know, actually, maybe that was all of the questions. I have a bunch of direct messages that I'm like filtering through. Hope says thank you, Andrea.
Robin?
Yeah.
Jeff says, Red Lodge has a vacant hospital with asbestos and other issues. How did the Blue Bunch Flats in Livingston get started?
Storytelling time. Long story, this is often how partnerships get created. I was contacted by the then executive director of the senior center, who was interested in building more homes that seniors could afford in Livingston. The senior center in Livingston has apartments above their center, and they wanted to look at expanding some of those homes. The private market developer, an investor that had bought the Livingston Hospital from Livingston Hospital, was interested in some form of partnership. And so we got talking about how we would approach that. And the long and the short of it is we were able to negotiate a buy-sell and a deal. And we purchased the hospital property as we put the financing package together with the housing tax credit program that we had talked about earlier. It was several years in the making because of the competitive nature of those housing credits. So fortunately, that person was a patient seller, sort of. We actually had to buy the property before we actually got the tax credit. So we took a risk and we did that. And, but having a patient seller and the ability to line up financing ultimately, especially on a property like that, is really helpful. So that's how it got started.
Thanks, Andrea. I appreciate that. So I think that'll be it for questions. But if you have more, then you can go ahead and drop them in the chat now with your email and we'll follow up. I'm also putting my contact info in here. So the Red Lodge Area Community Foundation has a workforce housing steering committee. We have been working for upwards of 4 or 5 years now on creating solutions, homes that people in town can afford, in town and in the county. So if you would like to learn more about that, get involved, call me, drop me an email. I would love to hear from you. And yeah, I think that'll close us out. Amy, do you have any last wrapping up to do?
No, I really appreciate everyone's involvement. Thank you to our panel. The information was extraordinarily informative. It's also late in the day. And we will be posting a copy of this on our webpage at beartoothfront.org. And stay tuned at the end of the summer for more information on our spring webinar and fall forum and fall webinar. And we'll get more information to everyone out probably at the end of the summer. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. See ya.